Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. With your host, Dr. Drumm McNaughton, CEO of The Change Leader, a consultancy that helps higher ed leaders holistically transform their institutions. Learn more at changinghighered.com. And now, here's your host, Drumm McNaughton.
Thank you, David. Our podcast today welcomes back one of our favorite guests, Tom Netting, president of 10 Government Strategies. Tom has worked in the public policy arena for over 28 years, advocating before Congress, federal agencies, and state governments on behalf of private institutions of higher education and post-secondary education companies. Tom is a leader in strategic policy development and advocacy in the areas of higher ed and workforce development, healthcare, veterans affairs policy, and the procurement of federal appropriations. And he joins us today to give us an update on what's going on in Washington and at the department. Tom, welcome to the show.
Welcome. I'm happy to be back with you, Drumm.
It has been a while. I've missed having you on the show.
And I, too, have missed having the opportunity to share time with you and your audience.
Well, there is so much going on up at the Hill. Normally, I say, hey, tell a guest, hey, tell us a little bit about you. But, Tom, we already know all about you. For better, for worse. No, wait a minute. We're not married.
No.
Close. But, no, there's so much going on up there. Everything from debt ceiling to the Congressional Review Act, Supreme Court. So let's just kind of take these topics one at a time, starting with the Hill.
Sure. It has been a very, very busy time. In fact, last week, not only as we watched both the House and the Senate working their way towards a debt ceiling bill to prevent our nation from going into default, there was also legislation moving that has gone through the House and Senate that I'll talk about. But starting with the debt ceiling bill, a couple of key facets of that legislation important to the higher ed community. Number one, the codification of a resumption of repayment for students. We've had the pandemic and the limitation on and actually the prohibition on actual student loan debt repayment unless individuals wanted to, and any accrued interest or collections activity for now, Drumm, over 3 years. Well, Congress has recognized, as the president has, that the pandemic is over, and we need to have individuals start the process of preparing to and then returning to repayment. So included in the McCarthy-Biden compromise was a proposal that states that 60 days after June 30th, so on or about September 1st, which was the timeline that the administration was looking at anyway, that the student loan repayment process begins anew. What that will include is not only the requirement for interest to start accruing and for collection agencies to start connecting and servicers to start reconnecting with the borrowers, but the hope is that they'll actually do so well before that. Given the next couple of months, the department is starting to reach out once again to the servicers, discussing how to implement contact with the borrowers to start to re-educate them and refresh their memory of these responsibilities. The transition won't begin right on September 1st. There'll be a little bit of a lag time for borrowers to get back into the transition. But the reality is that's a major change that was brought about and included in the compromise. In the broader context of the bill, one of the things that you hear a lot of people speaking of is the 2-year cap on overall spending at the discretionary level, discretionary spending. That will put considerable downward influence on spending across all forms of discretionary spending and include higher ed policy. It has potentially very strong issues related to Pell Grants. You have the Biden administration who has been seeking to double the federal Pell Grant within the next 8 to 10 years. And with this limitation, the ability to expand Pell Grants is going to be very hard to come by and would have to come potentially very much at reductions in other spending programs. So we need to watch and be very careful about how things play themselves out with regards to the debt ceiling bill and also student loan repayment.
Yeah, that's going to have some major impact at the department as far as their being able to move things through, will it not?
It will. It'll touch upon everything from not only the student side with the loans, but also the department itself. You may recall, and in some of our prior discussions, we know that the department had asked for money in the fiscal year 23 appropriations process in order to provide more staffing, in order to help them with implementation of the whole revision to the student loan system, meaning the system infrastructure, staff to help them with doing more in terms of FSA, the Federal Student Aid Division, and also more staff in order to do more on enforcement. They did not receive that in the discussions on the current fiscal year appropriations bill. And with these downward caps, the ability to have more individuals doesn't seem like it's going to come anytime soon.
Yeah, that's a shame because there's so much thing, especially the revision of the student payments. That's something that's really important.
It puts such a strain on all of these processes, Drumm. You think about the fact that, and I know we'll talk about this more later, but you've got the pending NPRM, you have the next round of negotiated rulemaking, you have Title IX, you have third-party servicers, all of these issues with only so many individuals within the department and the bandwidth to address them all. So that's one of the reasons why some of these are going to take longer, I submit to you, to become final rules than maybe they would if there were more individuals. Mm-hmm. Before we get into those regulations, though, I do want to talk about another major issue in Congress. Over the last 3 to 4 weeks in May and into the first week of June, there were efforts on behalf in the House and the Senate to pass a congressional resolution, and that was seeking to basically nullify, the word that's used in the actual joint resolution is disapprove, of the Biden administration's call for student debt cancellation, its income-driven repayment changes being proposed at the regulatory level, and the return to the repayment. The negotiations already have seen fit to put into law the changes with regard to repayment, but over the course of May and into June, both the House and the Senate voted in favor of disapproving of the Biden administration's proposal. 218 votes to 203 in the House, a very narrow margin, and also 52 to 46 in the Senate, with Christine Sinema, an independent, and John Tester and Joe Manchin, two Democrats, siding with the Republicans to move that forward. Now, we all know that the Biden administration is not going to walk away from this very, very strong campaign commitment that they made to student and borrowers and the efforts that they announced all the way back in August of last year. So it will be vetoed, and there won't be enough votes to override the veto because you would need a 2/3 majority at that point in both the House and Senate. So it won't go anywhere, and the Biden administration will continue to pursue these endeavors as we wait for the Supreme Court to also weigh in on this process and the two pieces of litigation that were heard before the Supreme Court back on February 28th. We anticipate that the courts will rule and that will take place sometime this month. So we see a lot of action around student loans, student loan debt, student loan cancellation, and a return to repayment in the future up on Capitol Hill.
What's interesting to me about this is, one, Lumina Foundation just came out with a study they do every year with Gallup, and they talked about the importance of the student debt forgiveness. Other guests we've had on from the Georgetown Center for Workforce and Education talk about how important it is to forgive the student debt so people can start investing in their futures, homes, etc. Why is it that people are opposed to the forgiving of student debt?
Those that are in opposition bring forward arguments and concerns that the elimination of this debt puts pressure on the overall fiscal budget and forces taxpayers who were not responsible for signing on to attain the debt or attain the actual resources to be responsible for repayment of those loans. That individuals who either had loans and repaid them, individuals who never chose to take out loans and went a different direction, and other individuals would all be responsible for covering the debt of individuals who chose to borrow to attend the institution. There are also other concerns about the fact that this is a one-time student loan relief, and that you're basically choosing a single cohort of individuals in order to receive this benefit and relief, acknowledging that it's post-pandemic, and certainly we've all gone through our own trials of Job over the last 3 years, regardless of, I don't think anybody would say they haven't been impacted by COVID and the process, but there are those that are concerned about whether or not this would be something that then becomes a year-to-year or several years issue. Let's be honest, the cost of this program is rather extensive. The write-off of these loans will be in the hundreds of billions of dollars. And again, that is a fiscal issue at a time when we're talking about debt ceiling, and we're talking about caps, and we're talking about limits on spending in a number of places.
Well, it's also interesting. You're absolutely right about that. But it's also interesting because the Lumina Foundation found that 70, I believe, I hope I've got this number right, of the 40% of people who have stopped out, left college or whatnot, 70% said if they could get their student loans forgiven, they'd go back to college. Right there, that takes care of the enrollment issues in higher ed. So it's going to be interesting to see the way that one plays out.
And to that point, you're going to also watch, there is the Fresh Start initiative that the Biden administration has brought forward so that all individuals that were previously in default are now going to be in repayment status once again. That gives them the opportunity to once again meet their obligations and even have access to additional federal resources to complete their programs, because many of those same individuals that have defaulted in the past, Drumm, are the individuals that need potentially the opportunity in order to return to school, the ability to have new loans. The other side of that argument is that you're taking individuals who have unfortunately not fulfilled their commitment in the past and giving them access to even more funds, potentially at the risk of them falling back into old patterns that we don't want to see of default.
And it would be so simple if we looked at higher education as the public good and we financed it all. But that's a whole different discussion.
Yeah, and if you can find the key to unlock that one, especially on Capitol Hill, you will have pulled off a miracle, sir.
Well, when I take a look at countries like Finland, whose taxes are higher than ours, but their undergraduate degree is completely paid for regardless of where you go, then, I know it can be done. It's just, anyway, let's not go there. The other thing before the Supreme Court is the race equality and admissions. We're going to have a decision on that this month. Rumor has it that it's going to be throw that out the window. We'll see. I suspect that's going to be the case. There's a lot of universities who've done very well, who've already embraced these principles.
Correct. And again, both of those are things that everybody here in Washington are assuming and are monitoring very closely that we think will come out this month. You're absolutely correct.
So moving right along, NPRM, Notice of Public Rulemaking. So gainful employment, that's back on the table again, or did it never leave the table?
I don't think it ever really left. It's gone through various iterations of set-asides or postponement or attempts to eliminate it, but always come back under Democratic administrations and their desire to address concerns of value. And you hear this more and more, financial value in terms of the programs that receive federal aid. The Biden administration put forth a Notice of Proposed Rulemaking that addresses 5 issues, 5 major topic areas, gainful employment being the one that has garnered the most attention. But there is also administrative capability, financial responsibility, certification procedures, and ability to benefit. Gainful has, like I said, obviously been the one that has caught the most attention, and probably rightfully so, given its potential impact and the toing and froing that has happened. That one We're seeing the department come up with a new metric, which is what they're calling an earnings premium test or earnings premium metric, which attempts to assess the earnings potential of individuals shortly after their graduation from programs below the associate's degree level at public and private nonprofit institutions, or in any program at a proprietary for-profit institution, going all the way up to their associate's, baccalaureate, and master degree offerings where schools provide those, in order to determine whether or not the earnings potential is comparable to or literally in excess of the average of individuals aged 24 to 35 coming out of high school. The soundbite sounds relatively straightforward, but there are a number of facets that go into those cohorts and those timeframes. If you're attempting to, from the school's perspective, that are going to have their eligibility for their programs based on this metric as well as the prior borrower defense to repayment metrics, the ability for a cohort going all the way to individuals that are 34 in age versus an individual 2 to 3 years after their graduation doesn't seem to be a direct corollary. So there is a great deal of concern over a potential apples to oranges comparison. There are a number of other issues that the communities have that are going to be subject to eligibility on lack of appeals rights, lack of the ability to challenge or even have a great deal of discussion around the calculation as it is being developed, the administrative burden on the back end to not only report to students the potential risk of a second year of failing a metric, but also having them verify, acknowledging the receipt of that information before any additional financial aid can be provided. So there are a number of issues and deep dive issues that literally are the basis of several hour webinars that I don't think we can go into here that are part of those discussions. What is important to note, however, is that same assessment of both the earnings potential as well as the debt to earnings will now be what is being called a financial value transparency list, which means that all institutions all programs at all institutions will start to see publicly provided information on how their programs fare under both of these metrics. It will only impact the eligibility of those that are subject to the short-term program cap, meaning less than associate's degree for state college and universities and others, but all proprietary programs.
So, say, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, this would not apply to them? This would apply to them?
This would apply to them as a consumer information assessment tool and presentation of data. It would likely come through another version of, or in addition to, the current college scorecard. Keep in mind, the department even already acknowledged that they are now have 4 years worth of both earnings and debt data for all institutions and their programs. So this is an attempt to provide the consumer with more information. There are those that query whether or not, if you have all this information, why not apply the eligibility criterion, even with some carve-outs, to all programs at all institutions, not limiting it more predominantly to the proprietary and certificate and diploma programs at other institutions. But we're not there yet. And the department and this administration and prior administrations have said that the way in which the definitions of an institution of higher education are structured in the law don't really suggest that that's the intent of Congress.
Well, that chance of getting another NEA through Congress, at least in the next 2 years, maybe in the next 10.
Well, yeah, the HEA and the ability to have those discussions are going to be certainly, probably individual issues will make it through, but a comprehensive reauthorization, even though Dr. Fox says that on the House side, they hope to do both the Workforce Investment Act, Workforce Education, Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, formerly WIA, now WIOA, and also higher ed over the course of this year and next. The ability to get that through the Senate and certainly to the finish line would be a tall task, to be sure.
I think so. If Lamar Alexander wasn't able to do it, we'll just leave it at that.
Right. And it's important to note that, there's some of these issues beyond just GE. GE is an important issue, especially that financial value, consumer transparency that I alluded to, is something that ACE, the American Council on Education, and all traditional academia is looking at as well, because without some of the carve-outs or without some of the recognition of unique characteristics of programs across the entire spectrum, Drumm, some things could look or be limited, labeled as failing or not achieving the desire, even though based on the socio-economic circumstances or demographic information or a number of other variables could be doing just well on other metrics. And you don't want to throw the cliche, but you don't necessarily want to throw the programs or the babies out with the bathwater if in fact they are meeting other type of important educational goals. Take in mind social workers, teachers, other occupations that we know, unfortunately, our teachers are not paid anywhere near what we probably value them as their worth, but their indebtedness in relationship to their earnings make it hard for a lot of those people to repay their loans.
Yeah, most definitely. We've also got the second forum on NC-SARA coming up.
Yep, 2 days away. Another important issue, as we look at so many of them, NC-SARA is in the process of doing their own internal review over the course of a full year on their standards, and they're doing a policy modification process is their words, of their entire set of standards. Early in January and into the first couple of months of this year, they provided opportunity for the communities to provide recommendations. There were 60 some that were provided. They're now in Forum 2 and Phase 2, where groups have the opportunity to respond to the 60 some odd proposals that were put out there, either in favor or desire to tweak or in opposition to those. And the verbal comments along with the written comments, the deadline for that has already passed, is on Wednesday. So the ability for people to talk about changes to distance education and not only the enrollment criteria, but other standards of assessment are very much an issue du jour right now. There is a lot of talk around these issues. You still have individuals that believe that the standards that NC-SARA developed with everybody but California are not substantial enough to protect all students and consumers, and want to see either assurances that the state's attorney general or state criteria are still all met, which would kind of basically undermine the premise of the compacts and the policies, while you have NC-SARA and all of the governors and all of the states from 49 other states and the compacts that say we worked so hard over 3+ years to develop what we think and truly believe is a good compromise between the high tides and the low tides of the policies across all states to come up with at least a baseline. So we'll have to see how that continues to play out. It is NC-SARA's goal to have their policy revisions completed by the end of this year to go into effect next year. This is also something the department is taking a look at. They questioned NC-SARA and the utilization of those standards in relation to the misrepresentation and aggressive recruiting and advertising and marketing changes to the regulations that go into effect July 1st of this year, part of the final rules of last year, and whether or not that significant revisions need to be done to NC-SARA or it dismantled. They didn't put that in the NPRM that is before us right now, but the next round of Neg Reg looks to talk more about state authorization and the role of the states. We could see it come up again there.
Yeah, and just speaking of the upcoming Neg Reg, I suspect that's going to get pushed out till the fall, maybe even after November. What do you think?
If you look at the timeline, Drumm, I think you're absolutely right. Go back to our prior conversation of a limited number of staff, a lot of issues, and the reality that the department is going to be under considerable pressure after June 20th to review what will likely be a very, very large number of comments on these 5 policy issues that they will have to review, make revisions as they see fit, and complete prior to the master calendar deadline of November 1st of this year in order for them to go into effect July 1 of next year. If you look at the limited bandwidth of the number of individuals and the fact that they've got not only these NPRMs to deal with, Title IX still sits out there, which we can talk about as well. We had issues around the definition of third-party servicers that the department put out and have kind of walked back from. They've got a lot to be dealing with. So I think you're right. I think that what you will see, and this is just my guesstimate, is that the department will likely put out in August a request for nominees to participate in the next round of negotiations, and will probably look to begin those negotiations with one or more committees probably into the winter, November, December, and beginning of 2024, simply because of the bandwidth and the capacity of the other things on their collective plates.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense to me. And the department, like you said, it's not staffed at the level. They didn't get the extra staffing with the debt ceiling bill. They're not going to get the extra staffing they need to be smart about getting things done.
Well, and they bit off a lot. Keep in mind, scheduled to go into effect literally less than a month from now are the significant changes to borrower defense to repayment, are the changes to fiscal discharge and other discharges, the changes to total and permanent disability, and so many other issues that were part of the 21-22 Neg Reg. We're seeing the second block of those being what the department is focused on right now. And again, also dealing with significant revisions to all of Title IX, the broader bill of Title IX, not the athletic portion of LGBTQ and competition in sports, which is delayed as well, but I'm sure we'll talk about that here in a minute. But, there's just a lot there. What's the old adage? The way you eat an elephant is one bite at a time. They have a very big elephant that they're trying to bite off one bite at a time.
Exactly. And thank you for the segue, Title IX. What's going on?
Again, that has been something over the last couple of months that took a great deal of focus up on Capitol Hill. You have the concerns around athletes and in particular their eligibility of participation in sports. Those regulations have been, we thought we were going to see further advancement of those. Given all the dialogue and all the discussion, those have kind of been delayed. So I still do anticipate seeing additional commentary and follow-up on those regulatory issues from the department in the not too distant future, again, because it was so prominent and prevalent in not only the media, but state legislation and federal legislation. What people, and I'm sure the schools are well aware of this, what also hangs in the balance is the broader comprehensive retooling and recasting of the regulations around Title IX. We're talking all of the VAWA regulations, all of the issues related to sexual discrimination, as well as so many other issues in the broader context, and significant revisions likely coming yet again to undo with the Biden administration the changes that were done by the Trump administration. So seeing how all of that plays out, the responsibilities of the institutions, the back and forth of where the new regulations will land with regard to protecting the rights and the concerns of the accuser, but also the accused. Again, making sure that there are more than adequate support services for those individuals that unfortunately are harmed in these circumstances, are all things we've got to wait and see how they play out as well.
It sounds to me like a national ping pong game.
Welcome to Congress in 2023, or politics, and again, let's be honest. I don't mean to be quite that flippant, but this is and has been the way politics always works. The pendulum does move from one side to the other, and we've had to adapt, and that certainly has become more polarized. Unfortunately, in the last decade or so, we are seeing less and less compromise in the middle. But when we see it, that's a good thing, I think. I wish there were more of those days. And certainly in higher ed, it used to be much more bipartisan than it is in this day and age. But again, we still have to chart our way through all of this and try and come up with the things that are beneficial for the students, the institutions, and ultimately the workforce when it comes to a lot of higher ed policy.
Well, we see that scale of justice, with the Lady Liberty, with the scale there.
Yep.
I don't think she's got enough arms to be able to balance everything.
Those arms are probably getting real heavy these days. Yep.
No kidding. So, well, Tom, this has been fabulous. What are the takeaways you've got for presidents and boards at this point, other than hang on to their hat?
Be aware change is coming on a number of different levels and be ready to adapt to that change. Another case in point is on June 9th, literally 4 days away from now, the end of this week, is another set of regulatory changes that I don't think any portion of the higher education community is fully prepared for. And I'm talking about the safeguard rules under the Federal Trade Commission and the protection of personally identifiable information, cybersecurity, and the like. We all know about Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act and the requirements that are there for institutions to have an IT coordinator and have certain things in place. But the new safeguard rules require much more substantive assessment routinely on an annual basis, the development of plans, the development of more than just an individual responsible for this. It looks to integrate this into the very culture and core of all institutions that have any type of relation to federal dollars, including all institutions of higher education. And as you and I have talked about briefly before, this is still just a stepping stone to what the Department of Education ultimately wants to do, which is get to NIST 800-171, which is JBLA on steroids. So again, IT infrastructure on top of the regulatory issues, on top of potential changes to standards on distance education, on top of the changes to all of your regulatory issues with financial responsibility and your requirements of discretionary versus mandatory triggers in the review of all institutions under financial responsibility. There's a lot to be reviewing and a lot to have your various staffs try and stay on top of.
Well, not only your staffs, but you as a board need to be looking at this from a risk management perspective.
Precisely.
So what's next for you, my friend?
Again, focused on the next 15 days to work with various communities from different facets of the community on a response to all of those regulations, taking a deep breath after that and probably looking at all of the responses to glean not only what the communities have put forward, but the nuanced differences in what people are looking for as an outcome, as we all then start to discuss what the potential outcome may be in November. There is also still other legislation that I think is ripe for consideration, which is in one bill in particular. We've talked about it before, which is short-term Pell eligibility and the opportunity for individuals in a lot of workforce, blue-collar infrastructure type certificate and diploma programs to potentially have access to Pell grants in order to meet the demand for the skilled workers to fulfill the infrastructure bill, and how that all plays out, again, with components to that, both on eligibility of which sectors of higher education and or which delivery mechanisms. You'll recall some of those bills prohibited online education from being a player in that process. I don't see how that's a good thing, personally. It also limited the eligibility in some of the bills for proprietary education to be included. Again, given the large portion of that community that's involved in those workforce programs, I think that the parameters and the guardrails, the term you hear used a lot around the Pell bill, are there for all types of institutions to participate. So I think that even the Democrats are getting to the point where they realize that they've got to move forward on that legislation. Other things that I'm tracking that I think are important, again, for schools are the July 1 implementation dates of the existing final rules going into effect. The misrepresentation and the issues surrounding enrollment and recruitment and the whole new set of regulations that are there are for all institutions, and all institutions need to take a look at the way in which their processes for marketing, recruiting, and enrolling students is taking place, because I think there are some things that all people need to be more mindful of than maybe they are right now. One more thing real quick. We didn't talk about third-party servicers. The definition of a third-party servicer was and is something the department is taking a very strong look at. They proposed a Dear Colleague letter with changes to those regulations earlier in the year, and then walked back 2 different timelines for implementation. I think that they're taking a longer look at the real world full implications of their prior proposal. They have some concerns, and they believe them to be strong concerns with OPMs, but the way in which they attempted to define a third-party servicer may have gotten too liberal and included too many entities that they really didn't intend, like the externship facilities for any one of a manner of apprenticeships or experiential learning in any forms of the disciplines, the recognition that there were probably more than even they appreciated entities that are third-party servicers that are international, including book providers and the like, meaning curriculum advisors and the like, that need to be part of the system that they had at one time at least considered precluding. So there's always something, my friend. There's always something.
Well, this is why we can't have you on the program enough.
Well, thank you. I hope this gives people, if nothing else, some things to think about. There truly is a lot going on right now.
There is. In the years that I've been doing this seems a crazier time than I've ever seen it before. And, politics aside.
And we still have others that we didn't touch on that hopefully we can do the next time.
Absolutely. We'll cycle back in another 3 months and have you back on the show.
It would be my honor. And again, thank you as always, Drumm, for letting me participate now.
Tom, it's always my pleasure. Take care, my friend.
You too.
Thanks for listening this week, and a special thank you to this week's special guest, Tom Netting, for sharing his Washington update with us. Join us next week when we speak with Courtney Brown, Vice President for Impact and Planning for the Lumina Foundation. Courtney will be joining us to talk about their recent report, the 2023 State of Higher Education. She'll unpack the data to talk about the untapped opportunity for 40 million Americans to earn a degree or credential, vastly improve their career and earning potential. And oh, by the way, there's an opportunity there for enrolling more students at our colleges and universities. Until next time.
Changing Higher Ed is a production of The Change Leader, a consultancy committed to transforming higher ed institutions. Find more information about this topic, along with show notes on this episode at changinghighered.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to the show, and we would also value your honest rating and review. Email any questions, comments, or recommendations for topics or guests to podcast@changinghighered.com. Changing Higher Ed is produced and hosted by Dr. Drumm McNaughton, post-production by David L. White.